What's up, sports fans? My name is Lucas Weiss, host of the Weesesports Chronicles podcast. We got a great episode for you today with Joel Darling. Joel is the executive producer of special events for the NHL, working at Rogers Sportsnet. In this episode, I chat with Joel about the challenges of producing hockey in 2020 amidst the global pandemic, as well as his sports media career, his ascension to being one of hockey's leading producers. And then we go into the future and have a conversation about what sports television is going to look like, what sports content is going to look like after COVID-19 from a production standpoint. So a really fascinating conversation with one of the leading producers in sports in this country. The Weesports Chronicles podcast is available on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. So make sure to like, rate, watch, and subscribe to all three of those channels. Now let's get to episode 91 with Joel Darling on the Weesports Chronicles podcast. All right, as I said off the top, I am pleased to be joined by Joel Darling. Joel is an executive producer with the NHL, with their special events. And I'm pleased to have him join me today on the Weesports Chronicles podcast. Joel, welcome to the show. Thanks so much for being here.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks.
Well, listen, we'll get into various parts of your career in just a bit, but you're one of my first producers that I've had on the show. So maybe just give the listeners just a little bit of an insight as to what your role is and what you do as part of your job.
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm the executive producer of special events with the NHL for Sportsnet.
Mm-hmm.
And basically the role that I have is overseeing some of the kind of major events that we do in conjunction with the NHL. So things like the All-Star Game, the NHL Draft, Free Agency Day, Hockey Day in Canada, outdoor games, things like that come along. Obviously, we did have free agency and the draft just after the season ended, but that's basically what I do. I oversee those projects, so it's really just overseeing them from start to finish. So as you're aware, some of the outdoor games are in a building that we don't sometimes do a game in, so it's a matter of organizing how we're going to shoot the game, working with the NHL, booking the crews, working on budgets, things like that. So that's really what it comes down to. I always like to think of once the event takes place, I hand it over to the producers and the directors at that point to run with it. But it's really kind of organizing and getting ready for the event to take place.
So you mentioned some of the events that you do in a given year. How long is the planning process? Like, is it a year out that you're already starting to think about the All-Star Game, the NHL Draft?
Yeah, I guess a few examples I could give you that. Obviously the draft was supposed to be in Montreal in the summer. Obviously, it didn't take place, but normally we would have probably gone to Montreal as early as. In fact, I think we actually did. We did do a survey. I actually couldn't go on this one because I was on another survey, but there was a survey done almost November of last year. So usually in some cases it's 6 to 8 to 9 months out. And sometimes that has to do with the weather. If we're doing an outdoor game in Canada, sometimes it makes more sense to get there early. But the NHL can really, once January comes along, when you think of the outdoor games that take place, the All-Star Game, free trade deadline, things like that. And playoffs, things get really bunched up. So in a lot of cases, we do try to get some things scheduled early. In the case of Hockey Day in Canada, I'm sometimes there a year out, looking at a location and trying to work with the community. So it just depends on a lot, what the community is like in the case of Hockey Day in Canada. And in other cases, some of it's a little bit easier. Like for, again, when I say a draft, we don't use the typical camera positions that are used at a hockey game. So it's a different playing field with regards to a draft. Same with the outdoor game, right? We don't do outdoor games that often. So the last one we did, which was a little over a year ago, was in Regina. So we would have been in that building, well ahead of time to try and make sure that we have the correct camera angles and that we have the right facilities on site to broadcast the game.
So when you're in charge of these events, what are sort of the conversations that are happening, let's say at Sportsnet? Like, are you talking with your fellow executive colleagues just to sort of see their ideas for the type of plan or the event they want to execute? Do you talk with the talent at all? What types of conversations take place within the company before a big event happens at the in a season?
Well, normally what happens is when we officially are told from our end that it's been scheduled, the first thing that we really do is meet internally, really with the technical folks. We have a director of technical operations within our building and some business managers who would look at things like budgets and things like that. So we would get a budget basically and start to work with that. So the early discussions really are around the technical side. So if I can use Regina as an example for last year, it's getting the specs of the building. Where are the camera locations in that building? Where can we park the trucks? Looking at things like that, and then starting to develop a crew. So, deciding who we need to bring in from outside of Regina, who we would use locally, because there are local technicians there as well. And again, looking at the specs of the building, booking a mobile, and starting to look at things like that. Starting to look at hotels, right? Where are we going to put people up? So early on, there's a lot of that discussion really about organizing the event. And in this case, we might have between 50 and 60 people on the show by the time the show rolls around. So a lot of that pre-work is done. And then as we get closer to the event, there's constant discussions with the NHL about the event, about what our needs are, and about what their needs are. And then as we get closer, then we start to get into things more associated directly with the on-air product. So who's going to do play-by-play? Who's the host going to be? How's it going to fit into the evening? Are we going to host on site? In some cases, we do host on site, and we'll have to build a outdoor temporary broadcast booth, if you will. So those discussions go on really kind of in the 6 to 8 months leading up to it. And then we'll bring the commentators into it and the producers into it. The producers would come in early so they're in the loop, and the directors on what we have to deal with that building. And then, a couple of weeks out, we would bring the commentators into it, explain kind of the situation where they're commentating from. As you know, sometimes we've done it on scaffolding right next to the boards. Sometimes we've had them up in the booth. It just depends. But we would bring them in fairly late. In the end, for them, it's not. It's another hockey game. Yes, they might be outside, and we have to talk about things like clothing and how they keep warm and things like that. But for the most part, the commentators really don't come into the discussion until we get close. So it's a lot. It's just like anything in television. It's a teamwork. There's a lot of people that work on it. It starts with a small group early out, the technical, trying to get the whole base of what is needed for that event. And then as we get closer, bring people into it as need be.
Obviously, this year with the pandemic has brought its own unique set of challenges, but let's just say it's a normal year for a moment. What would you say are the biggest obstacles or challenges in your role as a producer of these special events?
In a lot of cases, the biggest challenge is they normally are in locations that we're not used to doing a broadcast in. I don't mean that yes, we've been in the Bell Center in Montreal to do hockey games, as mentioned earlier, but this time we're doing a draft. So it's a different field of play. So a camera at center ice, is not as important as a camera on a jib that can shoot the stage, right? So, so in most cases, it's really about the field of play and what we're trying to do. So that's the same with Hockey Day in Canada. Being in different locations, and having Ron McLean host on site outdoors, right? How are we going to do it? So it's really dealing with the elements in the case of outdoor games or Hockey Day in Canada, but also, again, in some ways it's no different than a lot of things. We need to figure out where to put the cameras. We need to figure out what the storylines are, how we're going to shoot it, and take it from there. So they each represent their own challenges, but they're challenges that are that we live with every day in television.
Are there things that keep you up at night? Like, I mean, whether it's like the day before or maybe like during the event, that's just like, God, I hope this happens right, or like we're gonna need to like adjust on the fly.
Well, I think again, specifically with Hockey Day in Canada, the thing that always keeps me up at night and keeps me up months leading up to it is the weather.
Yeah.
Last year we were in Yellowknife, and on the day we ended up with a beautiful day, lots of snow, but really, really cold. But I've been in situations like in Corner Brook a couple of years ago where a rainstorm took out a sheet of ice outdoors that had been built by the city for the last 3 or 4 weeks, right? So they had to turn that around quickly. I remember boards being toppled in Lloydminster years ago from weather, the wind that just blew a rink, really an outdoor rink that was built by the city to pieces to some degree. So yes, weather, and certainly when we do outdoor games. Other than that, the challenge always is to just keep everybody moving in the same direction, people knowing what we're there to do, and trying to make sure that we follow what the story is. The beauty of all these events is the story's always different. So from a journalistic standpoint, you're still trying to to provide the viewers a story of what's happening, whatever you're doing.
No, I mean that's very true, and as someone like myself currently in journalism school right now, learning about production and things like that, I mean, the whole concept of a team is so important. I mean, I know in sports, especially team sports, I mean, working together as a team is so vital, but you really begin to appreciate when you're, in the control room, in the studio, how things just gotta gel together in order for it to all come together. And in the case of these big events, like you said earlier, it's 6 to 8 months of preparation in advance in order for it to be broadcast to millions of Canadians across the country.
Yeah, absolutely. It is teamwork, and without it, we'd be nowhere. And again, a lot of us have worked together over the years, and know each other really well. So that certainly helps.
You mentioned that. I mean, how often do you need to work with someone in order to really get to know them and their tendencies and their work ethic, etc.?
It does take some time. I mean, in the early days, when I was producing CFL football, sometimes you'd have a new director in there that you hadn't worked with before. And so it takes time sometimes. And I think, everybody is different. So you work with people differently, depending on what their personality is sometimes, their intensity. I think that's just the nature of any job, working with people in a business. You work with some people differently based on again, a lot of things. But for the most part, from a television standpoint, producing, directing, whether it's floor directors or associate producers, there's a base there that, again, hopefully anybody who kind of gets into this business has been able to kind of learn the ropes and learn from a lot of watching, for sure, a lot of listening. But by the time, I think, that we like to think that somebody sits in the chair, you're sitting next to somebody, you're professional enough that you're going to get through it. It can be a challenge at times, but for the most part, most people who are working together usually have had some contact along the way.
So it's the day of the big event, whether it's Hockey Day in Canada, the draft, the All-Star game. Are you there on site in a normal year, or are you back in Toronto? I mean, what's sort of your day of event process?
Yeah, no, I certainly on these events I'm on site for them.
Mm.
Again, we did the draft out of our studio in Toronto this year, so that was very different. But whether it's Hockey Day in Canada or a draft or an outdoor game and things like that, basically I would be on site. And again, as I said, I'm kind of overseeing the whole project. So by the time we get down to the days kind of leading up to it, it's the producer and the director who are really kind of concentrating on what the storylines are and the features and things like that. I'm sitting back a little bit, making sure everything goes smoothly, but kind of handed it over to the producer, who at that point is kind of running the show in the immediacy of it. But from my standpoint, it's we're there. It's certainly an outdoor game or whatever it might be. The draft. It's a long day on the show day, and it starts early with technical checks and facilities checks, as we call them, and having commentators come in and do some rehearsals and things like that. So I'm certainly in a draft. By the time we get to air, we've rehearsed for a couple of days, and not only with our commentators but also with our technical crew as well.
And do you, Joel, go through after these events like a debrief of, what went right, what to improve on, or is it sort of just like on to the next one?
No, we certainly do. And having said that, any event you do, you try new things.
Mm.
And the next event you go to, you might not try it again based on how it went. But in the most cases, yeah, even in your own head or after the fact, when you're looking ahead to the following year, you do want to debrief and make sure some of the things that you did were the right choices, and some of the wrong choices you maybe made, to improve upon them for next year. So it's just like any business, once you do a television show, your worst critique sometimes is yourself, and you want to try and improve it the next time around.
Speaking of trying new things, I mean, 2020 has been a year all filled with adjustments, and I'm sure, given your experience with the Stanley Cup playoffs, I mean, this has been such a year of adjustments trying to produce a playoffs with no fans in the stands, and that lacking that atmosphere that normally is such an important part of arenas during the playoffs. What were your thoughts on just the whole production as a whole, and just in terms of how are you able to overcome some of the inherent challenges of being able to, be a part of this, once in a lifetime event?
Well, I mean, it was a challenge. I mean, there's no question it was a challenge for everybody. When I think of some of my colleagues who had to go out to Edmonton and literally were in that bubble for, I guess it was over 2 months. That was tough. Now, I was based here in Toronto. The building, we produce our intermissions and the shows out of the CBC building. So we did have access to the building here, but again, like everybody, you walk into the building, you put a mask on, there's plexiglass up between producers and directors and associate producers, and it's a different, atmosphere. The commentators, are spread apart, they've got masks on, and you're trying to not necessarily, interact, and you can't really based on how you did before. So, I mean, from that standpoint, it certainly was a challenge. It was a completely different way of doing things. And again, I certainly empathize for the people who had to be in the bubble in Edmonton, who to some degree, they were a little bit in prison for a couple of months. Yes, they were doing lots of hockey games, but, once they left that rink, there was really nowhere else to go. So from that standpoint, it was certainly a challenge. I mean, the games themselves, I thought the hockey was fantastic. Early on, people said, "What's it going to be like without crowds?" I mean, I think in the end we got used to it. Like watching the Masters on the weekend, it didn't really matter to me. Did we miss the odd crowd roar? Yes. But in the end, the most important thing was what happens on the ice. And, from my standpoint, we saw some really, really great hockey. But yes, I mean, when you're producing a game, a goal scored, you look for that kid in the crowd who's, got the Tampa jersey on, screaming and yelling. And we didn't really have that atmosphere. Even producing features with players that we would have done in the past, right? You just can't do it. The interviews and the intermissions, that Scott Oak did, or Martin Ryan, or whoever did those interviews, they weren't as personable, right? They're in one room and players in the other room, and it's not the same. So it missed a lot of that. Obviously, I feel it missed a lot of it, but in the end, I don't think it tainted the cup in any way. I thought it was great hockey. And again, TV is a challenge every day. It was just another set of challenges that were maybe more than any of us has faced in the past.
You're absolutely right. And I think also as well as, people's tendencies are changing in terms of consuming content. I mean, obviously, 20, 30 years ago, I mean, linear television was the primary, focus. And now a lot of companies are moving digitally and in terms of consuming content. I'm just curious for you, Joel, like, I know you've been on events like Hockey Day in Canada and whatnot that, are so vital for, a platform like linear television. Do you think that it has the same impact in a year like 2020 where there's all these platforms and people are, maybe not as, focused on watching on television per se?
Well, it's evident in the numbers that we actually are seeing with viewers. We know that the NHL numbers were down, this year. And did it have to do the fact that it was in the summer? Yes, absolutely, for sure. But I was shocked to hear that the Masters numbers were down.
Yeah.
And down, like, I think they said since 1957. Which there weren't many TVs around back then. But when I hear that, like, I was so excited about the Masters and watched probably more than I ever have. And I also, now, happening at 10 o'clock in the morning is a lot different than, 4 o'clock leading into the 7 o'clock hour on a Sunday. So, yes, that probably had a lot to do with it as well. But I guess I thought, under the circumstances of the pandemic and people at home, that they're going to flip on their TV at 10 in the morning. But I think it just probably goes to show you a few things that, like hockey, like the Masters, April is a better feel for it, right? And we're used to it. And also, numbers later in the day certainly are better. Maybe it would have been different if Tiger was leading going into Sunday. Obviously, he wasn't. But there's no question that there's a lot of cord cutting going on, and less and less people are watching linear television. I just saw today Hulu, which I don't really know much about, other than they jacked the prices up by $10, which surprised a lot of people. So there's a lot of other opportunities out there, and as well as I do, whether it's Netflix or Apple TV or Crave or whatever the case might be, there's a lot of other options. So there's a lot of people who have other options that didn't have in the past.
Absolutely. And like you mentioned just about the ratings, I think, the hockey, the Masters, the NBA Finals, when these events are held in different times, I think it certainly has an effect on ratings. But I also wanted your thoughts, Joel, because, I mean, look, this is a year as well where remote production, as a result of the pandemic, is certainly becoming a lot more prevalent. Do you think that has a correlation at all with ratings, or do you think that that's not related, or is it just hard to tell or quantify?
Well, it's probably hard to quantify, but just by looking at my phone or looking at the internet, the amount of content out there now, sometimes blows me away. There's just so much content available for people, whether it's live sports, and again, I know we're in the middle of a pandemic, but whether it's the NFL or baseball or college football or Formula One or basketball or lacrosse, rugby, I mean, all these sports, it's certainly, there's certainly a lot of opportunities out there. When this pandemic hit, we were actually we did a show in conversation with Ron McLean that originally was going to be on television, but then, over the course of 2 or 3 days, we realized we couldn't be in the building. We quickly modified it for the internet. It went on to YouTube and Facebook. And there were a ton of things that we learned, just like everybody is out there learning on how, I don't want to say easy because that's not the right word, but how technology has given us the chance to do some things that we haven't been able to do before, right? So when you see sports shows being done from home, or in this case, it was Ron's show where he would have a guest or two, 3 times a week, where we were actually producing a show with me in my home, Ron in his home, and an editor or a technical operator, in another place in downtown Toronto. So it is amazing how this pandemic pushed some technology to a level that probably would have taken 10 years to get to, about producing content remotely. But again, I guess back to your original question, which was about, viewership. There's just so much more content available, and the amount of people that are able to now produce content outside of your normal television stations or radio stations, it's throughout the internet. So why wouldn't the numbers go down, I guess is what you might say in the end.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the conversation with Ron MacLean, because I had your colleague Rob Corte on the show, and he was talking about just some of the things that Sportsnet's been doing, during the pandemic. The conversation being one, the watch parties another thing, and I think the watch party is also a really unique concept, just to engage fans. And I know that those, shows were often of reruns of events, but I think you could definitely see that become more prevalent because, again, fans are, on the digital platforms. They're not necessarily watching linear television as much as they're used to. And I guess for all media companies now, it's just finding new creative ways to create and produce compelling content.
Absolutely. And, when I think of younger viewers, and I've got kids from the age of 17 to 24, and, I don't see them, moving out and having a regular cable service like, many of us, certainly my age group, have grown up with for the past 30 years. So, the idea that you don't have to have a regular television cable service is, it's no secret that, there's less and less people every year, every day. So again, that's a big reason why numbers are going down. And having said that, people are finding other ways to watch it when they want, where they want. So, it's easily understood why it's happening.
I want to pivot and talk about your career, because it's interesting that you were saying off the air that you're going to be teaching at Ryerson in the winter, and you're a Ryerson alum way back in the 1980s, where it was certainly a different time in terms of media and production compared to now. I'm just curious, Joel. I mean, were you always wanting to get into the production side of things in those early days at Ryerson and University?
I wasn't sure really what I wanted to get into, and I think it's interesting because I think I talk about this with some of the students now that I have, that I think when you get into a program in this business, you may think you want to be on air, or you may think you want to be a producer, but to some degree, the only thing you probably really know or can understand is what an on-air person does. I think a lot of people get into the business and they see a job like a producer, an associate producer, a director, or a cameraman, or a lighting director or something like that, and you realize, wow, there's all kinds of jobs or roles that I never ever really thought of. I think for me, I when I got into Ryerson, I really didn't have any idea what I wanted to do. I had done a little bit of kind of running around at the auditorium in Buffalo as a kid. My dad was a graduate of Ryerson as well. He was a longtime play-by-play announcer with the Sabres. So I grew up kind of watching what he did. And I might have thought that that's what I wanted to do, but I didn't have a voice like him. So I didn't think I would go far in the business. I actually did do play-by-play for the Toronto Marlies while at Ryerson on the local radio station. And I worked with Paul Romanek. I worked with Rod Smith. So I was doing play-by-play, and Rod was the analyst. And as you can imagine, Rod's deep voice with mine, I had no chance. But I was a runner at the time with Hockey Night in Canada. Basically, did everything from taking beepers that the referees wore to starting periods to bringing players in for interviews, and I got a real understanding of kind of what was going on behind the scenes. So I think it was probably in my third year at Ryerson. I thought I think I wanted to be a producer. I kind of liked what they were doing and the control they had over a show, and the excitement of being in a control room or a mobile. So that's probably where I kind of moved in that direction on the producer side.
And is it just a matter, like, I guess similar to on-air talent or a writer, is it just a matter of just getting your reps as a producer? Just, the more shows that you produce, the better you're gonna get, and the more you're just gonna evolve to the point where you are now?
Oh, I think so. I started out doing, as I said, I was a runner, but then I went on to become a font coordinator. So I was helping with basically the graphic management on CBC sports shows, the old Sports Weekend that Brian Williams used to host. So that's where I started. But again, from my standpoint, I was sitting right next to an AD or an associate director who was sitting right next to the producer and the director. So I think from my standpoint, being in a control room, I learned quickly, and I learned, about the roles of different people within the control room. And some of it's timing. I mean, I went from being a font coordinator to an associate producer, where I did all kinds of kind of features and openings for IndyCar racing, football, a lot of different things. And then really just, the first producer job I had was working on CFL football. So, and timing, right? Timing has a lot to do with it. But, the first few years of producing CFL football was really where I got my base in producing in the early 90s, where I was in a truck, 2 times a week or once a week, able to produce football games. So, reps certainly help. And I spent a lot of time in mobiles doing that.
How did the years then, Joel, of producing CFL football then prepare you then to transition over to hockey?
Well, I was a producer of the CFL for, I'm trying to think back now, it was probably 2-3 years. And from that role, I went into executive producer of the CFL on CBC. So that was kind of my first taste of being an executive producer. At the same time, I was producing other events. I was producing some golf events that we did. I was a senior producer at the Olympics. The first one I did was, I produced in 92 in Albertville. And then I was a senior producer. I moved from being in 92, I was a producer producing hockey in 92. And then in 96, I was in Atlanta producing one of the shows. So I was one of the senior producers. So even though I was executive producing some CFL, and then I was executive producer of a department, then I went on to be executive producer of hockey in 2000, while also executive producer of the Olympics. So a lot of things kind of all came together at one point there around 2000. But again, it's just like anything. You learn when you first start in a position. You figure some things out. You watch, you listen, you learn, and if things go right, you get more responsibility as time goes on, and that's certainly what happened for me.
I mentioned how, you're obviously, teaching at Ryerson still, and you've had a lot of chance to come across, and young talent and tons of talent throughout your career as, as a producer. What would you say, Joel, are some of the ingredients for an on-air talent in order to succeed in sports media?
Oh, there's a lot of things. I would say the most important thing, obviously voice is important, diction, grammar, all that kind of stuff is really, really important. But I would say more than anything is research and knowledge and of the game. Nobody nobody can do an event without being prepared. And some of the best that I've had a chance to work with, their preparation is at the top of the list, right? Being able to know the sport inside and out, but also being able to pick up the phone and make calls to people to get other information along the way is really important. I always use Cassie Campbell Pascal as an example of someone who is so well informed on hockey, and part of it is her husband is involved in the game with the Flames, and I know for a fact she watches games day in and day out.
Yeah.
She'll watch games off tape. She'll talk to people, right? So she's a classic example of somebody who wasn't trained necessarily in broadcasting, but she certainly has made a mark for herself, and a lot of that has to do with her preparation. She works hard at it, and I've talked to her about it before. She comes from being an athlete who had to prepare every day to make the Olympic team or to be on Team Canada, whatever the case that might be. And I think from her standpoint, she attacks broadcasting in the same manner. You need to be prepared. You need to have a routine. You need to have some responsibilities as a broadcaster that you need to kind of make sure you're prepared for. So that's the most important thing. And again, you can look at some of the best that I've worked with, whether it's a Brian Williams or a Ron McLean or a Scott Oak, a Scott Russell, like all those guys, Brenda Irving, right? They all just are incredibly voracious when it comes to information and trying to learn as much about what they are covering.
You mentioned some of those names, and it's interesting because I think, a train of thought is that, look, in order to get to a big national network or big market, you need to get your reps and experience in a smaller market, maybe out west or in a smaller town. But it's interesting how, though, that train of thought has maybe shifted a little bit, because you're seeing on Sportsnet like a Kyle Bukauskas, a young person being able to have a quicker ascension to a national spotlight. So I'm just sort of curious, Joel, your thoughts on whether do younger broadcasters need to necessarily go to a smaller market to get their reps, or if they are good, could they maybe get to a bigger market at a more quicker rate? I guess it depends ultimately, but just want your thoughts.
It depends. I think in the end, talent will win out. If you are extremely talented, and Kyle's a perfect example. If you're extremely talented like he is, you're going to get a role that's ahead of maybe where somebody else was. And when you say, in the old days, when I think of my dad back in the 50s, and again, he was a graduate of Ryerson who, felt he had to leave to Toronto. He leave Toronto. So he went to Sudbury and Kingston and a few other places. And there are people who still do that today. There are people who have done that in the last number of years. But, there's also a lot more opportunities to some degree. There's the TSNs, there's the Sportsnet. There's other, whether it's YouTube channels or radio stations or things like that, there are certainly other opportunities, maybe more than there haven't been in the past. Now, that's not to say it's not a good move. There are people who go off and work in small towns and do come back. So it does happen. But I do think, again, the other thing is today there's, people can get so much more exposure than they couldn't years ago. That person working in Kapuskasing at a radio station might be fantastic, but they don't really have any way of getting other people to see their work as easily as people can see it today, right? So, so I do still think the cream of the crop will come to the top, and which is the way it should work out. The best people should really have some of those really important roles, and that's where it ends up. I like to think in the end, it does end up that way sometimes.
Last question for you, Joel. Obviously, people that are ever in a truck or a studio or mobile, as you say, things could get pretty intense in there. I mean, if something doesn't go right or there's a lot of talking, sometimes raised voices happen. I'm just curious if you have a memorable story of your time in your career in the truck that you'd like to share, where things may have not gone according to plan, but you were able to round it back into shape so the viewer can really see, didn't even know it happened.
Well, I always think of a funny one that happened once when I was still in school at the time, and I was producing games on Buffalo Sabres television.
Mm-hmm.
My dad at the time was the play-by-play announcer, and at one point we were going to commercial, and I was talking into his ear and tried to give him a count to commercial. So he's throwing it to commercial and missed my count, right? So he spilled over into the commercial break, and we're in the commercial break, and I said, I think I called him Ted at the time just because it was a formal atmosphere. So I hit the key to him and said, Ted, you got to take my count to commercial. And so he didn't really say much, and we came back from commercial. And at the time, I was living at home in our house in Lockport, New York. I think it was the first year I was out of university. I was working in Toronto as well. But anyway, so we came out of commercial, and he was doing the game with Mike Robitaille, and he says, welcome back. And then all of a sudden he says, on air, he says, can you believe this, Mike? I've got my son in my ear telling me that I've got to be better throwing it to commercial. And he said, can you believe that? I can't even get him to keep his room clean at home. So I thought that was always something that I thought was funny at the time. Outside of that, I mean, I've worked with some people who have been some incredible screamers. I can remember back in the day in Buffalo working at a game, and the producer at the time for ESPN was not happy with a tape operator. And granted, the tape operator was probably not very good, but the expletives that came out of this producer's mouth, including him standing up and telling the tape operator to leave the truck, get out of my truck. I mean, he screamed at this guy, and the guy got up and he left his truck. And he did it with one less tape operator. So you do see a lot of different personalities in a mobile. I don't think there's anything that's really stuck out as being absolutely insane. I think for the most part, the people that I work, I'm happy to say are pretty cool and calm, and really you have to be, because it is a chaotic situation. I do know this past November when we were doing Craft Hockeyville, which is always one of the hardest things that we do, where we roll a tape of Gary Bettman announcing the winner. We cut to the winner and they're going crazy, and then we do an interview. As we were doing it this year, and again, this was one of those things that was a new experience, because normally we have a satellite truck in each of the 4 final locations to have a proper feed come back into the studio. Well, this time we had 4 Zoom calls, and which were going into the switcher. And I'll tell you, there's one job I would never ever want to do, and that is being a switcher. And this just solidified it this year when we had lost the feed out of the composite boxes that we were trying to do. And honest to God, this switcher must have hit 68 buttons within the span of 35 seconds. Yeah. And by the time we got to do the winner interview, he had straightened it out and settled it. And I have never, to this day, I think, seen a switcher so relieved. And we talked about it for days after that. But there are situations like that from a technical standpoint where you just think, oh my God, is this ever going to be fixed? And it was in this case. But yeah, it's never a dull moment. I think it's controlled chaos to some degree, but I think when I think of this business, it's one of the most special places that you could ever be, because it's exciting, and it's what makes the business exciting.
Joel Darling is the executive producer at NHL Special Events with Rogers Sportsnet. Joel, thank you for taking the time today for chatting with me on the Weesports Chronicles podcast.
Thanks for having me, and take care.